Let's kick this off. This is not going to be a typical seminar. We don't have to be that formal about it. So you're welcome to interrupt with questions or comments. Thank you, everyone, for joining online. I see some old faces, including some of my former students. Hello, Mike. Hello, Mike, Michael, and Mike. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, put your hand up on Zoom, and I think Mark is going to monitor that. So, and I have, like all my talks, way more slides than is humanly possible to deliver in an hour. So we're not going to get through all 10 lessons learned, and it doesn't really matter if we get through 3, 4, 5, or whatever the number is. The idea is to have some fun and be informed. The question is, this is generalizable knowledge or irrelevant musings before the pre-AI era. So why give this talk now? I know some of you do some very sophisticated life course epidemiology. My life course epidemiology is limited to staring at this curve, these curves, age, race, specific survival curves. And if you stare at them long enough, you eventually find yourself on a point of the curve where things start to change. And I become Medicare eligible next week. And so I'm right there. And you can see that there's a definite inflection point on the curve here. Fortunately, I'm still on the curve, but this is 40 years. I could wait to 50 years, but there's a fair chance I wouldn't be here in another 10 years. Okay. And then, of course, none of us need to be reminded about the consequences of staying on your job too long. Right? So we all need to know when to get up from the chair and move on. So these are my 10 lessons learned. All the way to AI, ignore it at your peril. If we get 2/3 of the way down this list, I'll be delighted. And but a little background first, because that obviously feeds into, my perspectives on things. So at age 19, back in Britain, I went to vet school for 5 years, got a veterinary degree at the University of Liverpool. One thing to notice, in 1984, a British university education was still free. So I left with 0 debt, which made an influence on the career choices I made. I also had wanderlust at the time and knew I didn't want to go directly into practice. And there was always this allure of going across the Atlantic to the United States. So I applied for internship programs and got matched to a place I'd never heard of, University of Minnesota in St. Paul, where I spent 2 years. I was a large animal surgeon intern at the University of Minnesota. And I developed an interest in abdominal disease in horses, equine colic. And interestingly, this was also the first place I took classes at the School of Public Health in Minnesota in statistics and epidemiology. And these were the hardest classes I ever took. I was just blown away by how conceptually difficult this was. But I was also attracted to this sort of difficulty in the subject matter. However, I still wanted to be a surgeon. So in 1986, I got placed at Colorado State to do a 3-year large animal surgery internship, residency, I should say, continue my interest in equine colic. And I met a young epidemiologist called Chuck Curtis, who was very influential to my thinking, very smart guy. So I started to work with him. I wrote a grant to fund a 3-year PhD project. I finished a master's. I got board certified in equine surgery. And most important of all, I met my wife, Nancy, who's got that look of expression of curiosity and concern on her face right now. Anyway, so that takes me through to, make the point about surgical residencies and how difficult they were. And after completing the residency, I realized I didn't want to do this the rest of my life. I bought these brand new Red Wing shoes on the first day of my residency. And these were the shoes I took off at the end just before I threw them away. They had holes in the soles, cracks in the leather, and they really looked a lot like I did. And this was 30 years before we would publish, New England Journal of Medicine articles about the surgical abuse, the abuse of surgical residency training. So we didn't recognize anything called burnout back then, but that's what I had. And that's why I wanted to go ahead and get into another field of medicine and get a PhD, which I did by going to the University of Pennsylvania. That guy I talked about, Chuck Curtis, moved from Colorado State to the University of Pennsylvania. I went with him, including Nancy, and we started a PhD there. And this is all relevant because Chuck was a year younger than me, but within 12 months of me starting this PhD, Chuck died of leukemia. And I didn't really have nobody really filled in to fill his place. So I pretty much had to do this PhD on my own. Graduated in 1993. And this is significant because two things. One is, for students in the audience, you need an advisor and an advocate for you when you get done. And I didn't have that. Also, don't graduate in a recession because you find that the universities are not hiring anybody. So I couldn't find a job. And I also didn't really fit into a recognized academic box because I was a surgeon. I got this PhD in epidemiology. And clearly, this guy didn't know what the hell he wanted to do. So I was having a hard time finding work. And really, option 4 on my list was to apply to the CDC. And I ended up matching to the Epidemic Intelligence Service. So I spent 2 years at CDC doing public health training. Applied public health training, the shoe leather epidemiology. And I mentioned this because this was then my out from an academic career that wasn't progressing as fast as I wanted it to. So the government bailed me out basically and gave me this fork in the road. I mentioned this because right now in the reduction of force that's going on, the EIS class for next year is not going to be filled and they're trying to lay off the people in the current class. So every year they have about 100 health professionals who enter CDC and do this training program. It's been going on since 1959 or something. And this year is the first year they're going to stop that. And they're again trying to fire the current class, which is total madness. So that outdoor or the opportunity the government is providing people who can't necessarily get on the straight track on academics is no longer going to be there, which is really worrisome. CDC then led to my first job, which is why we came to Lansing, Michigan. I was this chronic disease epidemiologist in the state of Michigan, worked on all of these different programs, got introduced to public health on the front lines of chronic disease prevention, did that for 5 years. But to progress up the ladder, you had to do more and more administration, which is something I don't like to do. So that's when I got my first job here at MSU. And so just the point for the students in the audience, I was age 40 before I got the job that I had in mind when I was 19. So it's a long road of investment and it's not a straight road at all. So if it takes you that long, don't worry about it because that's, I wouldn't say normal, but is well within the 95% confidence interval. So 25 years later, what's happened? I've done a few publications. I think this is my 103rd academic presentation. I looked up my H index. It's 75. I don't really know what that means, but it's a number. Funding, I wasn't really a big funder, but somewhere less than 10 million. And I like to say that I publish a consequential paper every decade. So maybe 1 out of 100 of those papers are really worth reading. I want to highlight 3. The first came out literally almost 20 years ago next week. This is a paper that reported on 3% of US adults, only 3% of US adults follow a healthy lifestyle. This got, back in the day when we had printed newspapers, this is the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, New York Times, picked it up, it was kind of fun. And then some of you will have seen this before.
Here's something interesting. According to researchers at Michigan State University, only 3% of Americans have a healthy lifestyle. Only 3% exercise regularly and eat enough fruits and vegetables. Just 3%. Well, good. That means there's very little chance I'll run into any of these annoying people. So good.
Still makes me laugh. So there was that. Here's another paper. I was trying to write grants to look at sex differences in stroke and the impact of stroke on women, and I was getting pushback from reviewers saying there's really not good evidence for this and it's mostly confounding and there's no really plausible hypothesis here. So one summer, I sat down and wrote a narrative review, the very bottom of the evidence pyramid, the stuff that we just sort of dispel. Narrative review, what do we need that for? This narrative review on sex differences in stroke, been cited over 1,000 times now, led to me establishing this ad hoc group called PROWESS, Prevention of Outcomes in Women Enhancing Stroke Support. We had our first NIH-supported conference in Washington, D.C. last April. We were all enthusiastic, happy, thinking that this would be something that could continue. And of course, now we look at this and think, well, that was a one-and-done experience. But still, we got in there before the tides had changed. And then, of course, you know, the last one is my dog walking paper, showing the marginal gain of having dogs and walking them to your overall exercise. This came out in March 2011, beautifully timed with the New York Times Tuesday Science edition that was all about animal health and human-animal bond. And so it got picked up. My story got picked up. What we're most proud about, both Nancy and I, is that our dogs, Cadbury and Bella, were named actually in the report. Dr. Mills, who runs School Labrador Mixed Hybrid Bella, said he was not surprised there was exercise that gets done in this household that would not get done otherwise because we have dogs. Unfortunately, they didn't publish this picture I gave them. There's Cadbury and Bella, probably because the guy who's walking these dogs looks like he's pulling security for a MAGA convention. So anyway, that's Cadbury and Bella for you. Okay, so let's get back to the list. So before we get into the list, though, we cannot ignore the last 3 months. The last 3 months since Trump presidency 2.0 started, it's less than 3 months, and it represents less than, well, just about 0.5% of my total experience of being in the United States and doing academics. But it's short, but extremely consequential. And if this had happened 10, 15, 20 years ago, clearly I wouldn't be standing here now, you know. So we've all got our favorite crazy stories that have come out the last 2 or 3 months, you know, layoffs at NIH, canceling long COVID research that was 2/3 to 3/4 of the way done. So clearly we've solved long COVID. Just stop defining it, stop researching it. And my thing that left me floored just a couple of days ago, CDC's Office of Smoking and Health was eliminated. Okay, so we want to make America healthy again. 1 in 6 adults are still smoking. If you wanted to do the first and most effective thing you could do to improve population health would be to take that 15% smoking prevalence down to 0%. And of course, what do? We get rid of Office of Smoking and Health. It's just craziness, absolute craziness. I did want to make this one point about all this Doge stuff about, you know, waste, fraud, and abuse. I came across this evidence report about a year or so ago when I was preparing for a talk on evidence synthesis and policy making. And the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, updated their evidence-based policy making report. First report came out in 1996. They did extensive literature review, over 200 papers they synthesized. They interviewed key informants at 23 different federal agencies over about a 3-year period and came up with these 13 points for this basically learning health system for how to take public money, integrate it into effective public policies, feed that back. 23 federal agencies were interviewed for this. There was only one federal agency that responded to their final draft report and committed to using this model for effective use of government funds. You know what that agency was? USAID, the very agency that got cut first in the Doge cuts, was the one agency that actually signed up to like use evidence-based policies. So that really didn't mount to much benefit for them. Still, okay, I move on. So let's talk about the crisis in science. This was always going to be something that I wanted to talk about. The crisis in science is a crisis in presentation. Mark? What's going on here? I didn't touch anything.
Well, that's why it's just.
While we're waiting, any questions on the panel? Say on the panel, on the Zooms, or any from the floor? Anything you disagree with right now? What I said? All right, you're gonna start disagreeing in a minute, I can promise you. Okay, so crisis in science. I was always going to talk about the crisis in science, but I've linked the crisis in science, which is the reproducibility problem, to the crisis in confidence about universities and scientific research. And so the Pew Research Centers have done a lot of good work in terms of national surveys, looking at attitudes of the US public on all sorts of things, including universities. So, and I know some of you are aware of this, but my point about presenting this is we haven't paid enough attention to any of this. And so this is a survey asking about the percentage of US adults, say, about following medical research scientists. About 4 in 10 say that medical research scientists do a good job of conducting research. 4 in 10, right? That's slightly lower than Trump's approval rating right now. Okay, that 35% think they care about the best of public interest. They provide fair and accurate information. They're transparent about conflicts of interest. So clearly the public has concerns about the way in which science is being conducted in this country. So that's the first thing I want to show you. And then you start thinking back to this. This is a absolute genius cartoon that came out, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, 25 years ago, basically making fun at the scientific community, basically coming out every day, promoting this latest and greatest finding, so take whatever risk factor, it can cause whatever disease you like in whatever population that you want to identify. Kind of funny, it's fun, but if you're supporting this research venture, and this is what you get as an end result, this sort of random, chaotic, every day there's another headline, you can start thinking about like maybe this is not a good investment of our money. So thinking about that, let's look at some of these other changing attitudes about university, colleges, and research. So the share of Americans saying colleges have a negative effect on the US is now 38%, gone up from 26% in 2012, and it's starkly different by your political persuasion. And Republicans in 2015 flipped to where now 59% of a Republican-leaning public say that universities are having a negative effect on the direction of the country. You could think back to what happened in 2015. There's a little bit of endogeneity here, like did we have these negative attitudes and we glom onto the candidate, or did the candidate come first and then promote the negative attitudes? I'm not sure. I think there's a little bidirectionality there. But this should be giving us pause. Should have been giving us more pause for concern before the last 3 months. Here's some other data. This is the percent saying they have confidence in college or university professors to act in the best interest of the public. Look at me. I mean, I'm going to act in the best interest of the public, surely. How is it that half of all Republicans say that they have no confidence at all or not much, and even 15% of Democrats say they have not much confidence in college professors to act in the best interest? So these are, again, I would say I would have regarded these as just kind of crazy. But now I'm looking back going like, we probably should pay more attention to this. And going forward, we probably should be figuring out why is this the case? Because it makes no sense for a university, which is basically a public institution, whether you're a private or public institution, you're essentially taking on a public function And we all work at a university because we think we're improving the world, that we want to make a contribution to the betterment of the country. And we're not doing that, or at least the perception is we're not doing that. So we need to kind of figure this out. I'm not smart enough to figure this out, but this is a call for the next generation to work on it. Okay, and lastly, you know, our university system going in the right direction? You know, more than half the people say it's going in the wrong direction. And when you look at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, there's some consistency. Both Democrats and Republicans say that universities are too expensive. 65% think students are not getting their skills needed to succeed. And this next question, too much concern about protecting students from views they might find offensive. I actually didn't know I was a Republican until I read that question, because 75% of Republicans say yes. So, you know, I guess I've become a Republican.
Matt,
Yeah.
do you know whether education was controlled?
Do I know when what? Sorry.
Well, I'm just asking if you know whether education was controlled. Was taken.
What do you mean? Are these results adjusted?
Yes, for education. No.
So you think there's a differential educational?
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think they're not adjusted, but that's an interesting hypothesis, and we should look to make that adjustment. Yes. Good point. Okay. So moving on. So my connection was that I think science is in a crisis. It's been in crisis for a while, and we're only just waking up to the fact that we are actually paying a price for this now, because the support in the country for what we do is quickly eroding, as we've seen in all this madness that's going on. So let's return to the actual crisis at hand, which is this reproducibility problem. And Nature 2015 did a survey, online survey. Yes, I don't know what the response rate was. That's true. But 52% of the people who responded said reproducibility is a significant crisis. And these are the scientists saying this, and they list a whole bunch of things about what's contributed to that. Selective reporting, pressure to publish, not enough replication, insufficient oversight, poor experimental design. 50% said fraud. I mean, you know, I'm skeptical, but I wouldn't have said 50% of it is fraud, but whatever. So even the scientists agree there's a reproducibility problem in the country. And so I would put it that the public's growing distrust in science is based on part of the belief that the findings are being oversold. And this problem is exacerbated by the poor reliability of medical studies, the sense that it's being fueled by misaligned incentives to gain research funding and academic achievement. That is true. Increasing number of retracted peer-reviewed studies and crooked researchers. That is also true. You can go to a website called Retraction Watch that monitors the number of retraction papers by different institutions and countries and subject areas. Limitations of the peer review process. We're all involved with the peer review process, and we all identify its limitations. Inability of the scientific community to control the growth in the number of medical journals, the paper published schemes, the paper mills, and the generation of fake papers. This is an ongoing problem. And then we haven't even talked about the concerns and risks of AI being added to this whole ecosystem of scientific generation. So these are real challenges, real threats. And the other more direct and controllable contributions to this reproducibility problem gets to the belief in the p-value as a measure of reliability, which it isn't. We set the p-value threshold way too high for identifying significant findings. And we have bias on behalf of the researchers. So we're all guilty, myself included, of overselling the importance of any single finding. We have insufficient scrutiny and reanalysis of data to demonstrate that the findings are repeatable. And our unwillingness to commit hypothesized. Now, Zachary Blount gave a talk, I think last year, about Semmelweis. And he talked about the scientific inference in the process 200-300 years ago. And we chatted offline afterwards, and we both sort of came to this idea of this hypothesized, which is the idea that instead of nurturing your hypothesis and babying it and letting it grow, we should be out there trying to kill it every day. We should be subjected to fatal blows to make sure that the hypothesis is still true. Instead, we don't do that. We nurture it, we promote it, we send it off in grants without subjecting it to the critical sensitivity analysis and the desire to kill it, right? That would give us better science if we did more hypothesized. And we also have poor training and sort of a general lack of skepticism and lack of knowledge really about how unreliable a lot of our studies are. So one of the ways we're guilty about overselling our wares, so you've noticed this in papers, they'll often have a little corner box on the front page and say, tell us what's really new about this study. Why is it important? If you're publishing in Circulation, the two questions are, what is known? What does this study add? You've got 1 or 2 sentences to fill those in. If you publish in the Journal of Clinical Epi, what this adds to what is known, what is the implication, what should change? Okay, good questions. But my question is, why don't we have to say, add to these questions, how likely is it that these findings are wrong? How big a departure from the truth could these data be? And what are the implications if these findings are wrong? I like these questions, but I wish we did more of these questions added to the box to really get that balance of not only the positives about this, but also the potential for the negatives of these findings, of believing something which actually isn't true. And, yeah, question.
If you're the editor and you gave those box questions, would you accept a paper that says the chance for this paper to be wrong is pretty high? and then what do you do?
Right. So the question was, would you accept the paper if someone else was honest to say, like, the chance of these findings be wrong? Absolutely, I would, because you're publishing those papers all the time anyway. So you might as well be publishing those and have an awareness of the fact that these might be wrong, and give the opportunity for someone to actually prove the case. Your pretest probability of these are wrong is quite high now, so it's easier to prove. That is a good segue, actually, because I was just about to say that a lot of my thinking is influenced by the fact that I'm a technical reviewer for a clinical journal that has modest impact factor. It's a journal Stroke, impact factor about 6 or 7. So we see decent stuff, not fantastic stuff. And I review over 100 papers a year as a technical reviewer. So I see a lot of stuff, a lot of shenanigans. And, this is sort of stuff I see all the time. The limitations, the last but one paragraph. These results could be subject to unmeasured confounding, selection, or measurement biases. Yeah, no shit. It's basically get out of jail card, So, like, why doesn't the journals make you write a 200-word minimum statement about the reasons why your data might be wrong? And the statement should reflect the likely direction of the error, the magnitude of the error, and what are the potential risks by, again, assuming something is true and they're not. 200 words out of a 5,000-word essay or submission, not a lot of words. And that's, that makes you think more objectively about the limitations of your data. Would I ever write 200 words like that? No, of course I wouldn't. I actually wrote a grant once to CDC, and I was told, you've got this grant, just put it in. So I sat down and wrote this grant in the most honest way I could, showing the potential positives, showing all the potential negatives. What do you know? It didn't get funded because it went out to external review, and the external reviewer said, well, I would never fund this. There's all these uncertainties about the data. It's like, yeah, no shit, it's good research. So there is uncertainty about this. And if you frame it with that level of uncertainty, you're not going to get funded, which is another house of cards we're built, because we're funding stuff where we know you cannot be directly honest about the limitations of your grant and what you're submitting, right? You cannot be honest about that. And otherwise you will not get funded. Okay, so how do we improve reproducibility? We've had all these steps put in place, pre-registration, publishing study protocols. My student here, Brent, was great for this when he worked for me. He would have all my stuff pre-registered. He was an early advocate for this. We've got reporting guidelines, the equator network that you should be all familiar with. And of course, we have these rules about open access, open data code. Okay, this only goes so far. It's reasonable, but we need a lot more push to get more sensitivity and robustness analysis, better peer review and editorial policies, greater attention and honesty from granting agencies, and basically more awareness and more skepticism, basically a little bit more honesty on everybody's part, both authors and editors and grant reviewers and project managers and everything else. Okay, but the single biggest contribution to the reproducibility crisis is our over-reliance on hypothesis testing. This is a great paper by Timothy Lash that got into this. And it basically, so this idea of hypothesis testing, for those of you who are not familiar, is the idea that we just subject all of our analyses, generate p-values, and publish only the positive p-values. So that's our hypothesis testing approach. So anyway, what does that do? It assures basically an initial overestimate of associations. It does not encourage the exploration of systematic errors or prior information. And when power is less than 100%, selection of statistically significant findings result in an overestimate of the magnitude of effect. I could go through these diagrams more carefully, but I'm going to skip over them. But the point is, when you've got low power studies, virtually all the positive observations, all the statistically significant findings from a low power study will de facto be overestimates of the actual true effect. That's what these graphs show. I won't get into the boring details of this, but you can read this paper and get back with me later for any clarifications. But the bottom line on this is the use of hypothesis testing to identify and report p less than 0.0 findings is a selection process that's guaranteed to overestimate effects and reduce reproducibility. In clinical care, we have this idea of regression to the mean, regression to the norm, the fact if you wait long enough, most people will get better anyway. And this is really an example of regression towards the norm. If you take a statistically significant finding and retest it, it will be more likely than not to become a non-significant finding because of this random error process that's generating these findings in the first place. And plenty of examples of this is an open science collaboration study that looked at over 100 different studies, did a replication of these 100 studies and found 82% that the effect size was smaller than the original study. So everything moves back towards the center after the first finding. So this leads us to the idea we need to kill the p-value. We need to kill it, okay? As a clinician, you get an intuitive understanding of the 2x2 diagnostic table and the intuitive sense of probability revision as explained by Bayes' theorem. There's one of the equations there. Okay, so I've just finished with my medical student class, and I think even the worst performing student in the class would at least be able to replicate this 2x2 table, which says you're looking for disease in the columns, present or absent. You've got a test result in the rows, positive or negative, and we have these measures of sensitivity and specificity to explain how good the test is at discriminating whether disease is present or not. Okay, why do I show that? I show that because this is the best way of understanding how significance testing works, because I've got the same 2x2 table format. Instead of a test result, I now have whether you've got a significant p-value or not as the row variables. And on the column variables, instead of disease, I have whether the hypothesis, the truth, either the hypothesis is true and the hypothesis is false. And I can complete these false positive, false negative, true positive, true negative cells using the concepts of alpha and beta. So from this, I can determine that the alpha of 0.05 is actually a specificity. It's the error rate when you're testing when the null hypothesis is actually true. And power is 1 minus beta, or the sensitivity of the test. So when the null hypothesis is false, type 2 error is actually a measure of power or sensitivity. So what do we learn from this approach? A few interesting things. All significant tests are set up with a specificity of 95%. Set up a statistical test to have 80% power means that it's 80% sensitive to detect that the null hypothesis is false. And then to interpret what a specific p-value means, you need to know the prevalence of the outcome or the pretest probability of that null hypothesis being wrong. Okay, so what does all that mean? It means the problem with the p-value is a lot of people forget what it means, and almost everybody overinterprets its value. So the correct definition is shown here. Probability of obtaining a p-value or test statistic at least as large as the one observed, given the null hypothesis is true, can be expressed this way. Probability of the data, given that the null hypothesis is true. The error people make, and it's a common one and a logical one, is to assume the opposite. To assume that it's the probability of the null hypothesis being true given the data. And that's not the case. And that has huge consequences. That's actually the predictive value. So rather than interpreting the p-value as a specificity, people are trying to interpret it as a predictive value. They're working across this table now, trying to infer the probability of the null hypothesis as being true, given a p-value of 0.05. And that is not possible. That is not what the p-value means. So researchers want to interpret a p-value as it was a predictive value. And that tells you how likely the null hypothesis is to be true. But the p-value can't tell you this, because to do so, we would need to know how likely the hypothesis being tested is actually true before we apply the p-value. In other words, we need the pretest probability, like in our diagnostic 2x2 table, we need the pretest probability of disease being present in the first place. We need the pretest probability of the hypothesis being true in the first place. And that's something we can't know. And when you figure that out, that unlocks the door to understanding articles like this. John Ionides' paper, published again 20 years ago. Now, I looked it up this morning, almost 7,500 citations. Why are most published research findings false? In the summary here, it actually says, and you know, the probability of a false finding is related to the ratio of true to no relationships amongst the relationships probed in each scientific field. What that's saying is you need to know how likely it is that the hypothesis was true in the first place, and that's something you can't know. And this decision about the limitations of the p-value has been discussed for decades. There's actually reports showing there's a systematic review showing that more than 100 people have talked about the limitations of the p-value since like 1955. Okay, and my point is, we haven't reformed the way we're doing science at all, despite knowing all of these limitations. Right? We have the American Statistical Association statement on p-values in 2016, talking about the things we just talked about. P-values do not measure the probability that the study hypothesis is true or the probability that the data were produced by random chance alone. Scientific conclusions in business or policy decisions should not be based on only whether a p-value passed a specific threshold, plus many, many others on the list, too many to read. Okay, so we need to kill it. And we haven't killed it. And if you go back to the scientific replication problem, why do we keep pursuing a model that we know has so many errors in it, right? We should replace hypothesis testing with Bayesian methods using prior information, estimation using prior confidence intervals, and quantify the potential of systematic error in every case. This is, if you want to know more about Bayesian methods, this is a nice 3-page report in Nature from Nuzzo about how we would use the p-value in a Bayesian framework. Here, this first row is basically adding the pretest probability of the null hypothesis being true. Okay, long shot odds, toss-up odds, a good bet it is true, and then these are the results that you get following statistically significant findings. And the bottom line is the probability of those findings being true or not vary dramatically along this axis or dependent, as we would know, by the pretest probability of the hypothesis being true in the first place. So this here matters, because this directly impacts what the confidence you have in the conclusion that you draw following these significant p-value results. Okay, so where am I going with this? I wasn't sure last week, but I was saved by the new NIH director, Dr. Bhattacharya. Joe? Where's Joe?
Acharya.
Bhattacharya. Not bad. Okay, good. I like it. Okay, fine. Anyway, Dr. J is our new NIH director, as you know, former Stanford economist. After laying off hundreds of people last week, in his letter to staff, he outlined 5 research priorities as shown here. I want you to identify the first 2. Population health. Do you know anything about that? Rigor and reproductiveness. Sick. I think they meant reproducibility. I hope they did. But the point is, what I've just been talking about is the number 2 priority for NIH going forward. So now is the time to really be thinking about the strategy for how we make scientific inference, killing the p-value, coming up with something else, and implementing it. Look, the doorway is open here for this. Combine that with population health, it's a slam dunk. They're going to be funded all the way to your 65th birthday. Okay, so okay, got 10 minutes left and we'll stop. It's always been about the cause. What do I mean by that? Identifying the underlying cause of disease and poor health has been a core mission of epidemiology since it began. Think about John Snow. But in the last 20 years, there's been massive changes in the way epidemiological methods contribute to the understanding of causation. Here's a couple of textbooks here. Think about my graduate training in the 1990s. What did I do? I had some intermediate statistics, simple linear regression, multiple linear regression, a bit of ANOVA, usual 500 level stat course you can find on any agricultural campus. I went away in the summer and learned about logistic regression. And then the next year I came back and learned about Cox regression. I was a veterinary epidemiologist, so we were interested in herd effects. So I got some training in regression methods. This again was early days of mixed models and to account for cluster effects. And then our causal inference class was simply a week-long qualitative sociological discussion about Hill's criteria. There was no science in it. It was just talking about the fallacies, the foibles of the 10 Hill's criteria for causation. Okay, that was pretty good. But things have gotten a whole lot more complicated when you're talking about causal inference these days. And you take racial disparities, for example. I gave a talk on causal inference and racial disparities at a conference last year. And, I threw this up. This is what you'd all identify as a causal diagram, a DAG, recently published. And I wanted to just point out here, a simplified causal diagram for studying racial disparities. And, of course, some of the most unquantified trained people are people doing health disparities. I showed them this and they were like, who is this crazy? Get him off the podium. It's like, nobody knows how to do this, including myself. But if you really want to advance health disparities, you've got to be learning about these methods. And it requires such an understanding of these new causal methods. I don't have the ability to do that, but hopefully some of the young people in this audience do. So my point is, what do we do? What do the 2020s graduates of the epidemiology and statistics program need? Okay, obviously they've got to get their intermediate statistics. Obviously they've got to get mixed or multi-level regression for cluster or non-independent observations. Then they've got to enter into a whole curriculum about quantitative causal inference, DAGs, counterfactual causal frameworks, ATEs, ACEs. Observational designs, Mendelian randomization, trial emulation, discontinuity designs, then advanced statistical methods, missing data, instrumental variables, propensity score methods, GSM medicine. David, notice I highlighted missing data methods in bold and underlined. Why? Because that should be the central part of this advanced statistical course, because so much about bias is about missing data, selection bias, missing data problem. Okay, so There's a lot more to just, I'm missing the outcomes data on 15% of my observations. Missing data is the core of some of these solutions to these selection bias issues. Okay, counterfactual mediation analysis, another class. Okay, quantitative bias analysis, another class. E-values, sensitivity analysis, R&I frameworks, the stuff that Ken Frank came and talked about last year at the seminar. And then we've got adding machine learning and AI. I don't know how you do this, but I wish you good luck, because this is what you need to know in order to keep ahead of AI. Because the easy stuff is coming. You just Google it and AI, and you can do the first part of this. It's only the people who really understand what this means and how to make causal arguments who will still be employable in 20 years' time. So my point is, epidemiologists need to be statisticians. And I think this department is great set up to do that, because we are a department of epidemiology and biostatistics. So we should have much more integration in the two programs and be pushing to try and deliver this kind of graduate education, because that's what's going to be needed going forward. So causal inference, I also make this point. Causal inference is the one area that epidemiologists must continue to own. No other scientific specialty can do the topic justice. Also, epidemiologists must continue to focus on issues of scientific bias, reproducibility, and statistical inference, because no other scientific specialty cares about these things. Every other scientific discipline wants to hide that stuff, right? But we've got to open it up, shed a light on it. This is what I mean by funding the bias police. We should be the bias police. We should be funded to do that, because nobody else is interested in doing that. Okay, one last thing and I'll quit. Why doesn't prevention work? It's because we are, in this country, we're too over-reliant on the medical system to deliver prevention. Tertiary prevention is okay. That's essentially what medical care is, the amelioration of the suffering of people with illness. Secondary prevention in high-risk groups, for example, anticoagulants in AFib for stroke prevention, goodbye. That's a good, good, effective, cheap, do it. Screening, secondary prevention, surprisingly inefficient and difficult to sustain. We're still going to do it because we feel like we have to, but we're really not making that much of an effect on a population basis. Prime prevention in the clinical setting is mostly ineffective and hopelessly inefficient, aka the wellness industry. Okay, total waste of time. Very few preventive medical interventions are cost saving, and a lot are not very cost effective. Got plenty of literature on that. You can Google me if you want more. This is just a basic one. Came out in New England Journal showing that preventive treatments were as expensive as curative treatments, which raises the point, well, why do the prevention in the first place if they're not saving any money? So what is the solution? This seems a little nihilistic. The solution is primordial prevention. What is primordial prevention? It's the prevention that people do without knowing they're doing it. It's people living in health with healthy lifestyles by optimizing nutrition, exercise, and avoidance of toxic exposure. It's living in a sustainable, equitable community designed to facilitate those lifestyles and minimize external harms. Okay, so what are the healthy lifestyles? I'll click through this, but these are the Life Simple 7s would be example: non-smoking, not overweight, physical activity at goal, healthy diet score at goal, not having high blood cholesterol, having untreated blood pressure below 120 and a fasting blood glucose less than 100, seven attributes of either healthy lifestyles or low risk factor profiles. I could bore you for hours about the benefits of these. Let's just read a list of when you have these 7 factors. What would the benefits be? You would decrease the risk of major chronic disease by 70 to 90%. You increase life expectancy by 6 to 14 years. You delay the onset of chronic disease by 5 or more years. You produce meaningful increases in quality of life, physical function, and decreased disability. You decrease medical expenditures by 1/3. You increase readily accessible, cheap. It's readily accessible and cheap. Has very few side effects. It's effective regardless of what age you start at. and is affected in all demographic subgroups examined to date. This exists, it's healthy lifestyles. Okay, and I can show you lots of examples, and it even reduces your risk of cognitive impairment. This was data from France a couple of years ago. There's dozens of papers showing this. Okay, so why? And so here's my last point about why prevention doesn't work. It's very rare that I go to the physician's office, but I've got a problem in my neck right now, and I'm at the physician's office last week trying to get weight in as you do in the room. I look up and I see this poster. I'm like, oh my God, let's just read this. An annual wellness visit is Medicare Part B benefit and is fully covered to you at no cost. It's different than an annual physical exam. Your AWV can be done at our clinic and remotely via telehealth, MSU Healthcare. Why are we paying for annual wellness visits when they do not work? I can show you a dozen randomized trials showing they not work. Here's one of the best ones, 10-year follow-up of 60,000 people in Copenhagen, Denmark, randomized to screening followed by wellness visits, correction of risk factors, group therapy, individual therapy, interventions lasting 5 years versus usual care, 10 years follow-up in a completely contained healthcare system that can measure every health event possible. What did they find? Absolutely no difference. Absolutely no difference in that prospective screening and identification in a population basis. So this doesn't work, and it's not. This is not prevention that we should be doing. Okay, I'll stop there. I do have others to talk about. Obviously, we're not going to. I did want to talk about the NNT-WET. It does make me think that I could come back, but I won't. But there are some topics though that I think this seminar is great for presenting, obviously, research findings, cutting edge, hearing from our peers. It's really valuable. But I think we also need an alternative model to discuss the things that's really impacting what we do and how we're doing it in a more of a shared open space. One would be a discussion about this whole ecosystem of publication, about the fact that we've got volume overload, the fact that we've got massive increases in number of journals. None of us can keep up. This is a real thing. 80 systematic reviews are published every day. How on earth do you keep up? You can't. Why are we building a system where none of us can keep up? It's just madness. All right. So I would love to come back. And in fact, I've talked to Iris Kovar at MSU Library. She might be online. I don't know. To come back and have an open discussion about this whole ecosystem of publication on library science. I don't understand it all, but it's a mess. I would love to have gone into this, but my kids told me, don't start with that. Don't start. So I haven't started with this. But what is the consequence of this for research disparities? We should have a post-mortem. If we pivoted so hard towards a certain policy direction, and then pivoted so hard away from it within a few years, we should know why, so we don't repeat these errors again, should they be errors. So we need to have a post-mortem. I would invite an open debate on this. We're not going to get this at the university level. We're not going to get this post-mortem at the college level. Maybe we're going to do it at the department level. Happy to debate one of you advocates out there for DEI. I'll take the contrarian approach and we'll do the post-mortem. I think it's worth having the discussion. The other thing is AI. Didn't have time to put AI in there. I don't know a lot about AI. I'm feeling like probably most of us don't know about AI, but like we should be knowing a lot more about AI because it's here. And I think we almost need a monthly seminar about AI and its consequences to education and research and what we do at the university. I don't feel that I'm able to do that. I don't feel I understand this, but I think it's coming. It's here. And just had example in my medical school class. This was the first year where it was clearly obvious students were answering using AI and sending me stuff that's like, wow, that really looks like what I just wrote. And actually it was because they got a hold of my answers, fed them into AI and spit them back. And so it looked very much like what I said, but it wasn't exactly the case. Either way, this is happening across all campuses, and we have not pivoted and not discuss what do we do about this? I mean, basically every standard educational assessment is now null and void, right? So I would say is, and I know I've seen some things, seminars and or things being discussed, and maybe I've missed the conversation, but I think we need a conversation about this pretty soon. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Any questions for the people online who have patiently been watching and still there? Surprised you haven't hit that X. The Xbox is that little thing in the top right-hand corner. You just hit that and then you just leave. Okay, good. Any questions from anyone?
Matt, I have a question.
Okay, this is Kelsey. Hi, Kelsey.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Nancy. Also, kudos for you to come into Lansing. So my question is, like, I work on the front lines of healthcare, specifically at Pine Rest, and we collect data and we analyze data, but we actually don't do anything with what the data is telling us. Is there a way for epidemiologists or biostatisticians or the field in general to sort of like bridge the gap between the academic, interpretation and then the actual application?
Yeah, I would absolutely, there is. I mean, this is the call for kind of applied epidemiologists, health services researchers who are working in clinical settings. And I think the learning health system model that's been developed over the last 10 years really speaks to that. So again, I showed that one evidence synthesis, that circle that the GAO had developed. There's a similar model for learning health systems, which talk about data collection, analysis, feeding it back to clinical groups, quality improvements, and then keeping that continuous cycle of learning health systems. So I think that framework is what you're speaking to. And, email me if you want a few leads, or you can just Google learning health systems. But that, again, it's an aspirational goal. It's been developed. Can we look around the country and say, like, look, these guys are solving the world's problems because it's a learning health center system? I say no, but I think it's a logical start. And I would use that. Yeah, good question.
I got a comment.
Comment, yes, comment from the floor.
I think it's
Dr.
interesting.
Reeves.
I think it's interesting you talked about the p-values and how a lot of papers are probably not reproducible and false. And there's also a increasing distrust in universities and researchers.
Yep, good.
What's the
Paid
connection
attention.
there and how do you solve that?
Yeah, okay, so what's the connection there if I didn't make that clear? It is the fact that people perceive that there's a lot of research findings coming out, being promoted in the press that are conflicting with others. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about the validity of the data that's being promoted.
Right, but what do you do about that? Like what can academics do about that?
First of all, come up with a different inferential model for when we decide that something is important or not. And be a lot more cautious before we start selling our wares, pushing our products to the public. So I think we have to be a lot more cautious, and we have to do a lot more validity checking on something before we say like something is genuine, something is true, and something is actionable. So right now we all know we're just cranking this stuff out and just throwing stuff at the wall, and a few things might stick and you go, yeah, look, I got a press release on this. It's great, but like, really, is that the scientific process that we should be doing when we think about promoting what we really know is good? Now, we know smoking is harmful. We can go to town on that all the time, but do we know that PFAS is harmful, or a million other exposures that we're still trying to look at? So I think more caution. I guess what I'm saying is more caution and less salesmanship and more science. Yes. What's that? Upper left corner. Oh, yes. Dr. Brown, how are you, sir?
Good, Dr. Reeves. I have a question for you, going back to your sort of biology, the biography, the story. And given what's happening right now nationally, wondered how did you navigate doing your PhD at Penn with no advisor? And what kind of guidance do you recommend for others that might encounter similar situations?
Yeah. It's a great question. First of all, I wouldn't advise doing a PhD without an advisor. It was certainly very hard. I mean, I did have an advisor on paper, but essentially they didn't really know what I was doing, so they left me alone. You know, I'm kind of an independent guy anyway, so then maybe that helped. But I did, yeah, I did talk to people and try and get some sympathy and some help from people. And this was before email. Yeah, it's hard to think, like I did my PhD before email. It's like, I don't know, remember how I communicated with people, but we did. I picked up like a phone, it was like on the desk and had a cord on it. And so I talked to a few people like that, but I was definitely isolated. And I was definitely floundering, and probably Nancy can remember, I was not a happy individual. And it was really the CDC EIS program that wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. That was like being thrown a safety buoy in stormy waters and being able to swim to shore, because I was kind of lost and there wasn't a lot of jobs. And so that opportunity was great. Obviously, it was a major U-turn in my career and has led to everything else. But without that, I'd have been sunk, literally. Question.
Well, this is more of a comment.
Comment. Here we go.
I mean, I've been thinking about some of these same things, and, you know, it's kind of like we're stuck a little bit because the less funding that universities get from the public funds, the more we're relying on grants. The more we're relying on grants, the more people are trying to crank out papers and crank out grants, and the more we're rewarded for that through the tenure process and through, I mean, you know, if you listen to, for example, the dean's town halls, you know, he's promoting who is making the most money in this college and who's bringing in the most money and who's getting the most press, you know, attention. And so we're kind of stuck because it's this cycle. How else can we even be here if we don't get these grants? And so it is kind of an opportunity maybe right now to rethink and, you know, but I don't know how much power we have as a department or as individuals, but I do think that, you know, how can we think about rewarding people for doing good science? The tenure criteria seem like the place to start to me, but, you know,
yeah,
there is also this financial issue. We don't have our department, we don't have students, we don't have anything if we don't get these.
Right, we need grants, and unfortunately, as I think I've sort of shown it, you know, we need to oversell our wares in order to get these grants. So that's not going to change anytime soon, probably. So I wouldn't suggest like a completely honest approach on submitting your next grant. I think you have to be selective about what you share. I think you've just got to do some. I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but other than you've got to do science that you're comfortable with, that you can sleep at night, and you're not going to worry about the accolades that somebody else is getting. You've got to do the science that makes you happy, that you're comfortable with. And there's always going to be more people out there who are getting more accolades than you are. So that's a metric I wouldn't look at too much. But I know what you mean. I see the things being promoted all the time, and I'm just going like, really? You know, like those Wednesday.
I agree with what you're saying, but that doesn't solve the systemic problem.
No.
You're just all like, well, I'll do my best.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to systemically change the system. I don't know how to do that, but I think conversations about that, like I've learned that you've been thinking about these same things too. Good. Then are we all sort of thinking about these same things, and are we able to, you know, I think, you know, I don't know how to change the system. I'll just stop there. Question, comment.
I think another
Oh, Dr. Ebel, how are you, sir? Thank you for joining. Quick question, what do you have?
Well, a couple of comments, a couple of things you said. And Matt, great talk. This was so much fun to listen to. Really resonated with me. One of them, this idea of primordial prevention, because we have to bake prevention into our communities. We have to design communities for human beings and not for automobiles. It's funny, whenever I go to Europe, I often go for a month or more. I don't exercise. I don't go to the gym. I don't change my habits except that I walk 10,000 more steps per day. And I eat healthier and I eat more fresh food. The other thing I wanted to add, and so, we have to do a much better job. I'm working on a project in northern Michigan in a small town that might involve removing some parking to put in bike lanes. You would think we wanted to take every 10th person in Onekama and shoot them in the head the way they're reacting to. It's just, anathema to remove parking.
Yeah,
Anyway, the other thing was, the number of systematic reviews and randomized trials has gone up astronomically, but a lot of it is crap. I mean, a lot of it is just terrible. The number of poems that we identify, the practice-changing research, we've been doing this for 25 years, hasn't changed.
Yeah.
I think the amount of important practice-changing work isn't necessarily increasing that much. It's just all the noise is changing. And I'll stop.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and that makes it more, what's making systematic reviews more and more difficult is the volume of information you have to go through and our inability to efficiently weed out the wheat from the chaff. There's way too much chaff in there, and this explosion of research that's going on, most of it isn't very good. We saw that in COVID. There's just massive amounts of COVID data, and you look back on it and going like, 98% of it was just complete junk. Now, there's a legitimate reason for that because we're all in panic mode and just trying to generate stuff, but it was symptomatic of just like how poor our systems are to control the publication of just garbage. One more question.
One more last thing, touching on the last point you were making, I'm glad you went through all 10 topics.
Okay.
So.
AI.
Yes.
AI.
Office of the Provost, MSU has an AI summit on May 7th.
I did see that.
Yes.
Yeah.
About teaching and AI, how to make MSU a leader in this.
How to make America, how to make MSU great again. Fire all the tenured faculty, just plug the algorithm into AI.
Even today, the journal club, I made my student talk about a paper about AI and everything.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I totally agree with the last point.
Yeah. So one of us, I'll see what I'm doing on May 7th. I'd like to go to that, but I do think, so I want that AI office to come here every semester and talk to us about how they're thinking about AI, how we should be thinking about AI, and really integrating it. I wanted to show the slide that the Sam Altman comment about AI. It's like, you're not going to lose a job to AI. You're going to lose it to a person who understands AI better than you. And that, that is like the issue, right? You've got to keep ahead of AI better than your peers. Yes.
I'm gonna ask burning questions.
Okay, question.
You mentioned that epidemiologists should be biostatisticians. I completely agree with that. And I feel like it's really hard. I still struggle with this. I feel like it's not dichotomous. We have to be trained in both. But wondering if you can comment on your thoughts on the continued role of epidemiology training among the future generations of physicians.
Huh.
You've been actively involved in training the future generations of medical school students in this school. And we're uniquely equipped as a medical school where we have a department of epidemiology to train physicians. And Dr. Ebel and Dr. Brown on the call who do have that, training, but I still feel like encounters with primary care physicians specifically and residents, it's still not enough. We have few courses, but what do you of epi training among?
Yeah, so the question for those people who didn't hear, but it's what is the future of epi training for medical students and medical training? And I don't know. I am just, I've been involved in that medical student course for 30 years. I've just about, I think I've done it for the last time. And it's getting harder and harder to do that, to convince young medical students that you ought to know the science to really make them more scientific. I think that's the thing I'm struggling most with is I find it depressing how unscientific the incoming class is, or their unwillingness to embrace science and the principles of science and understanding the foundations of scientific inference, which we try and get at. I mean, it's really hard to educate students at that depth anymore. So I think I'm failing at that job. I think the student body has passed me by. Like I haven't kept up with the new trends on how people get educated and want everything in a 2-minute YouTube, fancy video, 50-minute lectures. Are you kidding me? So all of that needs to be reformed. But it's more important than ever. And going back to Dr. Ebel's point, there's so much crap being published now that is not very good, and the inability of physicians to sort that out. It's hard enough for me, but we really still need to emphasize their training in that. And I don't think they're going to get it in medical school, but I really think in residencies is where we've got to make the residencies more scientifically rigorous. And that's another conversation. I despair sometimes about the rigorousness of some of our clinical residencies. I mean, I think they're shocking, to be honest. That's not a very positive way to finish, but it's a great question. Okay. Well, this was a lot of fun, wasn't it?
Yes.
Sort of.
Yeah. Come back and get encore.
I think I will come and do an encore. I want to talk about the overblowing science, and I want to talk about AI. Maybe I'll get a person from the AI office to come and we can have a little tete-a-tete. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your attendance.